Hello everyone, my name is William Kwan and welcome to my presentation for Economics 112. In this video, I'll be discussing three main topics to help us understand how modern economics functions. First, we'll talk about trade deficits and surpluses and how they affect the nation's economy. Then I'll explain the shift from pre-1930 economic thinking to Keynesian economics and why that change was so important. Finally, we'll discuss the difference between monetary and fiscal policy and how both are used to manage the ups and downs of the business cycle. So let's start with trade balances. A trade deficit occurs when a country imports more goods and services than it exports, meaning it spends more money buying from other countries than it earns from selling them. A trade surplus is the opposite, where exports exceeds imports. The more money flows into the country than out of the country. These concepts are a part of the balance of payments, which helps economists understand a country's overall economic relationship with the rest of the world. Trade deficits and surpluses tell us a lot about a country's economic structure, whether it's more focused on producing goods or consuming them. For instance, let's look at the United States. The US has consistently operated under a trade deficit for many years. In 2003, for instance, the US imports were around $3.2 trillion, while exports were closer to $2.2 trillion. That's roughly a $1 trillion deficit. The main reason is that the Americans consume a lot of imported goods, things like electronics, clothing, and cars, while much of US production focuses on high-value services like finance, technology, and entertainment. A trade deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can mean that consumers have strong purchasing power and that foreign countries are willing to invest their earnings back into the US economy through bonds and assets. On the other hand, countries like Germany or Japan usually have trade surpluses because they export large amounts of manufactured goods, such as automobiles and industrial machinery. Their economics are oriented so that they earn more from selling abroad than they spend on imports. So now we're going to look at pre-1930s conventional economics, otherwise known as classical economics. Classical economists believed that the economy naturally relegates itself through the forces of supply and demand. If unemployment rose, for example, wages would fall, making it cheaper for firms to hire workers again, restoring that balance without governments getting involved. This belief is summarized by Say's law, which stated that supplies create its own demand. In other words, producing goods automatically generates income and spending. Classical economists supported a laissez-faire approach, which means that the government should stay out of economy as much as possible. They believed that free markets were efficient and intervention would only distort natural market forces. However, the view of classical economics began to break down during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Despite falling wages and prices, unemployment remained extremely high, and demand for goods didn't recover on its own. This crisis revealed a major flaw in classical theory. Markets are not always self-correcting in the short run. And then this is where John Maynard Keynes came in. Keynes argued that during recessions, people and businesses lose confidence and stop spending, which leads to even lower demand and production. He believed that in these cases, governments government intervention was not just helpful, but it was necessary. By increasing public spending or cutting taxes, the government could raise overall demand and help pull the economy out of a downturn. To summarize, focus, uh, classical economics focused on long-run stability and minimal government involvement, and Keynesian economics, on the other hand, focused on short-run fluctuations and the need for active policy during recessions. For example, during the Great Depression, the New Deal programs in the United States reflected Keynesian thinking. The government invested heavily into infrastructure and job creation to increase demand and restore confidence. Even today, many economic policies, like the stimulus packages during the COVID-19 pandemic, followed the Keynesian logic. So next, we're going to look at how governments manage the economy through monetary and fiscal policy. So monetary policy is handled by the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. It involves changing interest rates or adjusting money supply to influence borrowing, spending, and inflation. For example, when the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, it becomes cheaper for people and businesses to borrow money, which encourages investments and consumer spending. So, on the other hand, fiscal policy is determined by the government through changes in taxation and public spending. So, during a recession, a government might cut taxes or increase spending to stimulate economic activity. During periods of inflation, it might do the opposite, raising taxes or reducing spending to cool the economy down. Both tools are meant to smooth out the extremes of the business cycle. For example, during COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates close to zero and purchased government bonds to keep credit flowing. That is an example of expansionary monetary policy. And at the same time, the Congress passed several stimulus checks that provided direct payments to households, a classic case of expansionary fiscal policy. These actions together helped prevent the economy from falling to a prolonged depression. In contrast, during periods of rapid inflation, the government might raise interest rates to discourage borrowing and slow down spending. All of these policies connect to what we call the business cycle, the natural pattern of economic growth and decline. There are four main stages to the business cycle: expansion, peak, contraction, and through. During an expansion, economic output, income, and employment rise. Eventually, the economy reaches a peak, which is a second stage where growth levels level off and inflation may increase. Then comes the third stage, which is contraction or recession, where the GDP for 2 or more consecutive quarters falls. Unemployment rises and consumers' spending declines. Finally, the economy hits a through, which marks the lowest point before recovery begins again. Government policies aims to reduce the severity of these contractions and maintain a steady, sustainable growth. To wrap up, This is what we talked about during this presentation. Trade deficits and surpluses show how interconnected national economies are. The U.S. continues to operate at a trade deficit, reflecting on strong domestic demand and a reliance on imports. The shift from classical to Keynesian economics reshaped how we understand recessions, highlighting that active government involvement can be crucial during these times of crises, such as COVID-19 and the Great Depression. And finally, both monetary and fiscal policy serve as key tools to maintain balance across the business cycle, helping to promote steady growth and minimize economic hardship. Thank you for watching my presentation.